So I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called 12 Traits. In a past life, I used to head up a lot of the UX efforts for Big Fish Games right here in Seattle. So recognize this guy over here. For the clicker, here we go. So is it just the play button? So today I'm going to talk about why hyper-personalisation is incredibly important in the games that you have right now, and why now, out of all times. Why psychometrics are also an integral part of that process. And if you're just using behavioral data alone, it's worthwhile, but this is a huge missing piece. And the type of impact that you can have as a result of this. So, what is hyper-personalisation? How is it different than maybe you might have thought of personalization in the past? A lot of companies use segmentation. You might hook into things like PlayFab in the back end and segment around whales or different monetization groups or behavioral groups. But when you're doing hyper-personalization, you're hooking into a lot of different data sources. So historical data, pay data, present data from current behavior, psychometrics, taking that all together and then moving it around that individual in real time. So it's not just kind of a bucketed segment situation. And what kind of results, broadly speaking, can you get from hyper-personalization? So Salesforce, interestingly enough, looked at multiple different apps and assessed about 150 different people. Saw 4x increase in session length within apps, 4.6x conversion rate, and 5x per session spend. So when you look at those kind of numbers and you're thinking about your own games, you're probably like, that'd be nice to have. So at this point in time, the question isn't really how do we change or how do we start doing hyper-personalization. It's more where do we start. Game companies are busy. You have a lot of people doing a lot of things. It's challenging to figure out these dynamic systems and how do we create adaptive systems for our players. The reality that we live in right now is gamers expect you to know their needs. So as of 2020, 50% of gamers literally expect before they even started playing your game that you're just going to anticipate their needs. It's challenging. Player preferences, they're changing faster than ever before. The more games are out, the more things go into content, the more content there is, the more people are changing and wanting new things. And people want personalized offers and experiences. And lastly, just from a retention perspective in games alone, so Delta DNA with behavior data broke apart all their experiences where they were doing hyper-personalization and saw an increase of about 200% in retention and 40% in revenue. So that's just specific to the gaming industry. So why hyper-personalization and why psychographics and why right now? As some of you are probably aware, there's over 800,000 games just in the App Store alone right now. Makes up 70% of Apple's revenue. And 1,000 new games are released every single day. It's a very different world than it was just 5 years ago. It's a lot more competitive than it used to be. On top of that, there's this huge engagement problem that nobody really wants to talk about. Last year, about $15 billion was spent acquiring new players, and an average player leaves a game within 7 days. So 85% of users leave a game within 7 days. If you look at those kind of numbers in other industries, it just doesn't cut it. It's not great, right? On top of that, we're looking at CPIs. Last year, 28% more costly than the previous year. So companies are starting to try to get more creative. If you talk to UA teams, like, oh, we're using Snapchat, we're doing actual more formal marketing, we're moving out of just pure UA spend. So that's a big challenge. And just to kind of cap it all off, Mike Capps, the former CEO of Epic Games, said, if I were to pick the 20 best developers I've ever worked with, and someone gave me a $30 million, I couldn't even guarantee you a 10% chance of a hit. It's so hard and so luck-based at this point. So, this world we live in, there's more and more people and more personalization that's needed, and how most companies are addressing it is through behavior alone. And that's where a lot of the struggle comes from. So this might look similar to a lot of you guys and the companies you work with, where you're looking at spend, you're looking at fail, completion, demographics, session duration, clicks and taps. You're using Unity Analytics or PlayFab or Game Analytics or these other backend tools, and it's not bad. Like that behavior stuff's really valuable and super necessary. The challenge is that when you're pulling in behavior data, it's only half of the picture. You can think of that in terms of like, all of us today, we're all at PG Connects in Seattle. We're all in the gaming industry probably. And so to Facebook or toward behavior-based algorithm, we would probably all get the same offer leaving here if it was just segmenting us based on that. The reality is who we are, what we care about in life, we probably have a lot of different interests and needs. So the missing piece to really getting hyper-personalization to work really, really well is psychological data. So what you need is actually the observable behavior that you're seeing in the game. There are these things like an individual's values, their psychological traits, their cultural attributes. There's the late Cambridge Analytica that we all know about. I mean, they focus just on personality using the Ocean model, and that might have swayed an election. So there's power behind this stuff, and with power becomes there's responsibility behind that, of course. But one of the things that I think is really valuable about understanding these sorts of things is when you do understand these things, you can create experiences for your users that are more valuable to them too. So the idea of shared value. So if you're trying to get ahead in this space today, just to summarize, you're looking at behavior data, combining it with psychological data, and personalizing content based on that, and then gaining intelligence over time. So working with your data scientists, seeing if you can do machine learning, seeing if you can create feedback systems within your games where your users can train those algorithms. Amazon does this a lot, where they'll give you multiple different offers and see what you click on. And then based on that, they're continuing to hyper-personalize to you based on what's in your cart. So there's multiple areas within games, and we'll go over that in a little bit, where you can sort of create these hyper-personalization loops. But over time, you're just going to see uplifts in retention and revenue, period. So now we're on to understanding your players. A lot of you guys probably work with UX teams or research teams or data scientists. It's a hard process. It takes a lot of time from just the beginning of recruitment, where you already have players, and then connecting all these things together. I was doing some analysis on the average persona projects that I've done over my past career with companies like Intel, Verizon, Microsoft, gaming companies. It's usually about 200K to 1.2 million, depending on the project. And usually by the time you get done really understanding players in depth, especially in gaming, a lot of the times the games have moved forward. So it's a challenge to streamline these processes. So just to break it down, we're going to dig into how you guys might be able to do that at your current companies. So 3 main ways of understanding a person: observation, interviews, questionnaires. From an observational perspective, what you're really looking for are friction points a lot of the time. Where the most friction is happening. As well, we used to use like Affectiva at Big Fish, they still do. But one of the things we always found was that emotional labile, like how labile emotions are up and down, that's more of a sign of engagement, not paying attention to just, oh, this person was happy, this person was sad, this person said this thing sucked. You want to see kind of that up and down curve. So emotions and friction, great from an observation perspective. Interviews, we'll go into questions in a second, and then questionnaires. And then if you want to combine interviews with observation, you don't have a lot of time, contextual inquiry is a great source. So you're gathering that data, then you're doing psychographic data analysis, pooling that together. Why that's really important compared to behavior data is psychographic clusters hold up a lot longer over time. So how you behave changes a lot. You're in Seattle now, you might be somewhere else tomorrow, you might fly out the next day, etc. Where who you are, probably going to be the same now that it is in a week, 10 days. So if you're really looking to understand a person in real time and let that hold up over a period of time, it's just a much more stable substrate. And then you can let the behavior data play with that. So you're doing your analysis, connecting that to behavior data, making sure you're doing reliability and validity testing. A lot of game companies, including very large ones with very big teams, they'll do questionnaires and they'll kind of say like, oh, we're trying to understand our audience. And let's say you ask somebody, do you like to achieve X in a game? And then you go and measure and you see that based on the behavior, these players don't really achieve a lot in the game. Well, that would tell you that question has very poor construct validity. So it's called ecological validity. Is basically, does this measure what the person's doing in the real world? So if you ask a question and it seems to measure achievement, and these players also achieve a lot in the game, probably a good question. And then there's segmentation on the backside, which you can play with that. But then digging into these three methods that you guys can use right now to really understand your players better. So back to the observation side. Mentioning friction and paying attention to those points, as well as the emotional aspects. Beyond that, you get into a lot of gray area. So I've seen game teams where people say, oh, like this didn't work very well, and they'll go back to the team and they'll tell them when actually it's something that was really important for that game. So taking those just with a grain of salt, being there to observe, and then in terms of interviews, just to give you guys some like really valuable questions if you're trying to understand personality. One great one is 3 words that a best friend would describe you, 3 words to describe yourself, 3 words your mom would use to describe you, and start doing a 360 on the person, and just don't give them time to think, and you'll literally start getting a really clear picture of who this individual is. I think it was the CEO of Toyota that another one he did was he would say, who are you? And he'd keep asking that repetitively, 5 times, 6 times. And these are kind of great interview questions to really get at psychographics, because what you're doing is you're not giving people the time to really think about it, and then you start to get more towards essence of who they are. And on the other side, just asking, what'd you do last weekend? So get an idea of how the person spends their life. A mistake that a lot of interviewers make when they're trying to understand users is they always bring it back to their game. That's what behavior data is there for. So, how much do you like our game? When do you play our game? These kind of questions are not really going to work very well. And then on the questionnaire side, so this is where you can get really deep data from your users. So developing things is pretty tricky. One of the best models out there that's publicly accessible is just the Ocean model, kind of your openness, extroversion. You guys probably heard of these things. A lot of that's online, but make sure you're always checking validity measures. So things like construct validity, ecological validity, internal validity. Otherwise, you can end up with questionnaires that are not really measuring anything. But this is going to help you also get at those core elements of your players. And I always recommend doing all 3 of these things together. So what do you want to measure when you're looking at psychographics? There's a lot of things you can measure. You saw the screen earlier, but these I think are the 3 that are best to focus on, where you're going to get the most uplift. So culture, that's things like people's habitus, where they came from. You can understand what sports they played when they were growing up, their ethnographic background, those sorts of things. Then opinions, attitudes, and interests. That's kind of what Facebook really loves to measure. So you can, if you really want to, scrape Facebook for it. But you can ask, and the more you get to people's belief systems and what they really believe in life, that's more core to them. So think of all this spectrum as, what are the things that are not going to change over time? And the less likely they're to change over time, that's when you know you're measuring the good stuff. And then personality. So back to some of the questions we asked earlier, like those are great questions, but digging into things like extroversion or grit, these are the things that start to become relevant to games. So how do you take this data then, combine it with this whole hyper-personalisation thing and make it really work? Messaging and advertisements is a great place to start. So one example I can give you guys right now. We'll measure like the level of fantasy in our customers' players. There's a game that had like 45-year-old males, typical demographic story. They were making their art to be really realistic. They thought it was kind of a blue-collar audience. They were doing all their design based off of just pure behavior and demographic data, and saw that their level of fantasy for their most engaged users was actually pretty high. All they did was make the art in the game more cartoony. Their CPIs went down by 400%. Quality of install went way up. So, and that's all they did. They didn't change the copy, anything like that, and then created multiple permutations of that and kept seeing the CPI drive further and further down. So the permutations become more and more relevant. There's a company called Stanley.ai. What they'll do is create just massive amounts of permutations of an ad and then serve them up accordingly based on a machine learning algorithm. So that's one great way to do it. Then in-game offers. So a lot of people already do A/B testing. Hyper-personalisation and A/B testing are kind of like PB&J if you bring in a data scientist. So when you're doing these, and you kind of, like, let's say you understand that this user is more extroverted, they see themselves in a certain way, and you take that into account when you're giving these personalization offers, and then just start, this is what Amazon does, recording which ones people are clicking on, or how the amount of time the offer is on the screen before they click. There's a guy out of Harvard who did a lot of work on basically time to click. So faster clicks happen usually means higher levels of engagement. And then over time you can start to learn about that individual. So connecting an intelligence system to that ID. Delta DNA can do a lot of that stuff on your back end side if you work with them at all. And then another huge one, difficulty. So we had one game company we worked with where all we did was optimize difficulty based on players' level of grit and resilience. That's all we did. They had a machine learning algorithm already that they were using behavior to optimize difficulty for. The game went from $2 to $3 million in 1 month and sustained, and nothing else was changed. So free-to-play games, most of your money is made from close wins a lot of the time. So that's a huge area where you can personalize. And the reality is, with hyper-personalisation, adding psychographics, where that's really important, is different people have different capacities for difficulty. You know, some days you have a bad day, you're like, I just want to win a few levels and close the game. Other days, you know, you're up for a bigger task. So if you understand, for example, cognitive load, how much time people are able to recuperate from that stuff, that's a great way to tune. And then biggest one of all, where you see the most uplift by far, there's this huge sort of buzz around social and all this kind of stuff a few years ago, which was hilarious because human beings are inherently social. We like to talk, but it's more about community, right? You want to feel like you belong something. And psychographics, I mean, they're the why of all this. So it's how does our brand or our game fit into that person's life? And one of the beautiful things you can do with hyper-personalization combined with psychographics is if you have an ID and you have this data, you can start to have these players bump into each other more and more and more. So it's kind of like a place where if you had all your best friends that you met throughout your life, but you just bumped into each other a lot earlier. And what that does is create better communities and make you feel more like you're a part of something. So just to tie this up, there's 2.3 billion mobile gamers today, which is a couple, and 1,000 games released every day. So, you know, just to think, how are you guys going to stand out in that environment? And hyper-personalization with psychographics is a great way to start. Cool.
Thank you very much. I love when you talk about grit and openness and all these other kind of ocean kind of elements. It's just that fundamental principle about getting under the bonnet of why we feel these ways or why we react in particular ways. I think it's incredibly important. Is it something that requires you to have large budgets and large amounts of data for, you know, these kind of indie teams to take advantage of, or is it more of a mindset?
I think it's both. So on the mindset side of things, Forrester, this is an old study. It was like 2010, but they looked at groups that took a lot of time to basically create personas. And they found that this was within Fortune 500 companies mostly, so outside of gaming. But when people just made up personas and they were completely inaccurate and basically bullshit, there's still a 10% uplift in ROI. Where when they did it based off of research, there's a 400%. So, and then there's that whole gradient in between, where, you know, I mean, in the past, a lot of game design was, I like this experience, I'm kind of designing for me. And there's a lot of studios that we work with that are still trying to get their game designers to get out of that mindset.
Actually, I tend to use made-up personas to start when I kind of want to get a framework for a design and then populate it with data to see if I'm completely nuts or not. Yeah. But that may be just my particular quirk. Any quick questions? We've probably got time for just one question, really. This one here, cool.
Of course, there's some irony in the fact that if I'm getting manipulated based on my level of grit, I'm having a more enjoyable time with the game. But from the perspective of a player and consumer, I intuitively am very averse to that idea being applied to me as a consumer and gamer. And the problem with hitting that bottom 80% of the iceberg is that you have to use questionnaires and inventories, and it's not just behavioral observation. So inherently it's disruptive to me and my ignorance to the fact that you're doing that, to ask me those things. So how do you work with that catch-22?
So I guess I could speak to how we as a company work, which is we avoid a lot of those things. I think for if you're just an average game studio, like GDPR, double, triple opt-in, making sure that the people, that's per like the person, what they see is about 25% of people who want personalization will opt in for it. So that's still a huge amount of your audience. So, and that number keeps going up year on year. So just there, just say, hey, would you like to, like Oath does it online, you might have seen them before. They'll explain what they're doing very simply. Would you like the personalization to be a part of it? So that's the easiest way to do it, and it's not super disruptive. Questionnaires, most large game studios do a lot of them anyway. So like the questionnaire that we use to build all of our intelligence off of, it was 60 questions. And we would get like 20,000 users in one day to fill that out. So but that questionnaire took like 6 years to develop, and using a lot of Fortune 500 companies that, gamers are much more engaged than someone who uses Intel, for example. But on our end, like what we do is, so we have basically machine learning, and now we can do deep learning too, intelligence in the background, where we can understand behaviors across multiple games at a time, and then in real time we can map these things that you or I as human beings couldn't understand map back to a psychometric, and then we can start to allow games to adapt to those IDs. So we actually don't know anything about any player. We have zero personal data on the person other than their ID and that, and we can learn about that. And then you could think of it as like, it's basically doing what a game designer does, spending all his time tuning, trying to figure out how to, like think of Candy Crush, that's like built on a house of cards of a very finely tuned system. So yeah, we basically just do that same thing, but we're starting to innovate on basically being able to deduce it from behavior. So that's where we're like working with like the NIH. It's a serious science and has huge implications, and there's definitely ethical aspects to it that we have to consider. The good news is every American citizen who works with us, though, they like the GDPR, a lot of people don't know this, but if you're an EU citizen, you're in the US, you're still covered by the law. So even Americans still get covered by that within our system. So yeah.
Let's just not talk about Brexit. But one thing I would add to that, just a simple thing, though, is that the key thing here is it's not our job to manipulate. Our job is to understand and make a better game. And a lot of people get worried about this stuff because the kind of language we tend to use about the psychology and the motivations and all this other stuff it's not to make you do things you wouldn't naturally do. It's for us to understand why you do them so we can make a better game. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yeah.
And on that note, thank you very much.
Yeah.